The rain came in around 2 in the morning and did not stop. Reed Colton lay in the back of his truck with his boots still on and listened to it work its way across the roof in sheets, the kind of rain that did not care where it landed, that fell on Walmart parking lots and river bottoms with equal indifference. Atlas had taken the passenger seat again. Reed had stopped arguing about it 18 months ago. The dog weighed 91 pounds and had decided sometime during their second winter together that the passenger seat was his. Reed slept in the back. That was the arrangement. He was not sleeping now. He watched the rain drag itself down the windshield in long, crooked lines and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he got to rest on most nights. His mind was the kind that did not power down cleanly. It idled. It cycled back through things he had already processed and processed them again, looking for errors it had missed the first time. He had been doing this for 8 years. The phone was on his chest. He had not looked at it since midnight. When it buzzed at 2:47, the sound was so specific in the silence that Atlas lifted his head from the seat before Reed could reach for the phone. The dog looked at the back seat without turning his body, one ear forward, one ear doing that thing with the fold. Unknown number, area code he did not recognize. He answered anyway. He always answered. It was the same reflex that had kept him monitoring frequencies in another life. You picked up because not picking up was a choice that could not be undone. Mr. Colton. A woman's voice, professional, tired in the way people get tired at the end of long workdays. This is Margaret Ashe. I'm a paralegal with Fisk and Ashe Associates out of Parsons, Tennessee. I'm sorry to call so late. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Reed sat up. The sleeping bag fell to his waist. How'd you get this number? Veterans Administration Forwarding Directory. It took some patience. A pause. I'm calling about the estate of Earl Ray Colton, your uncle. He had not heard anyone say Uncle Earl's name out loud in 2 years. The last time had been a voicemail. Earl's voice, slow and deliberate, the way it always was, asking how Atlas was doing and whether Reed had made it through the winter all right. Reed had called back 4 days later. No answer. When did he pass? Reed asked. 11 days ago, pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in February and declined quickly. Another pause. He left a will, Mr. Colton. He was very specific about several things. There's a portion of the estate designated for you. Reed looked at the rain on the windshield. In the front seat, Atlas had not put his head back down. He was watching Reed with the unhurried attention he saved for moments when something was shifting. How much? Reed asked. The paralegal was quiet for a beat longer than she needed to be. The monetary value is $3, but the asset itself is $3. Yes, sir, and a vessel, a decommissioned river ferry called the Harlan May. She's been moored, well, she's been grounded technically, on the south bank of the Tennessee River in Decatur County for the past 31 years. The woman's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone reading exactly what a document said, without editorializing. The will specifies that the vessel transfers to you in full undivided ownership. Your uncle was very clear on the undivided part. Reed was quiet for a moment. Through the windshield, a car pulled out of the far end of the lot and drove north on the access road, headlights sweeping once across the truck cab. Atlas tracked it, then looked back at Reed. Was there anything else? Reed asked. In the will? There's a note. A personal note, separate from the legal documents. Mr. Colton asked that it be given to you in person, not read over the phone. A brief pause. I can tell you he seemed to feel it was important. Reed thought about Earl at a kitchen table, in a house he had never visited, writing something down, making sure someone would deliver it correctly. Earl had been the kind of man who did things correctly, even when there was no audience to notice. I'll come, Reed said. Give me 2 days. He hung up, sat in the dark for a while longer with the phone on his knee. Outside, the rain eased slightly, not stopping, just shifting its approach, coming now at an angle through the lot so that it caught the sodium lights and made the pavement look like it was moving. Atlas stepped over the center console without making a sound and settled his weight against Reed's side. Not asking anything, just present in the way the dog was always present, occupying exactly as much space as was needed, and no more. Reed put one hand on the dog's flank, felt the ribs rise and fall. $3, he said. Atlas did not respond, which was, Reed had come to understand, the appropriate response to most things. They drove through the night and into Tennessee with the windows cracked, because Atlas preferred it that way. By the time the hills started coming up through the dark on either side of the highway, the rain had moved east and left behind a cold that smelled like river water and turned leaves. October in the South had its own particular character, not the aggressive color of New England that people drove hours to photograph, but something quieter and more personal, like a conversation between the trees and the light about something they had been discussing for years. Reed did not listen to music when he drove. He listened to the road. It was an old habit, and he had stopped apologizing for it. The town of Parsons sat in a low fold between two ridge lines, the kind of place that had organized itself around a courthouse square, and then waited to see what would happen next. Reed arrived at 9 in the morning, parked on Main Street, and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the law office across the street. A small sign, white letters on black, Fisk and Ash, Guesties, 1974. Darren's car was already there. Reed recognized it immediately, a silver Lexus with dealer plates from a Knoxville lot parked at the curb with the aggressive straightness of someone who parked like they were making a statement. Darren had always parked like he was making a statement. Atlas was watching the Lexus. Not with his ears forward, not tense, something more subtle, a slight adjustment of his head, a recalibration that Reed had seen before when the dog encountered something that required a different kind of attention than usual. It was not a threat response. It was something quieter and more deliberate. The dog was simply paying a specific kind of attention to a specific thing. Reed got out. He told Atlas to stay. Atlas looked at him once and then turned back to watch the Lexus, which was going to have to be good enough. The waiting room of Fisk and Ash smelled like old carpet and printer ink. Darren was standing near the window with his phone in his hand, and he turned when Reed came through the door with the ease of a man who had rehearsed the moment. How to stand, where to look, what expression to wear. He was 57 and looked it in the way that some men looked their age honestly, with the weathering of a life that had been lived in offices and at dinner tables rather than in truck cabs and parking lots. His handshake was firm and entirely impersonal. "Reed?" He said the name the way you say something you have had in your mouth for a while and are finally putting down. "Darren." They sat across from each other and did not speak until Margaret Ash came in. A woman in her late 30s with reading glasses on a chain and the focused competence of someone who had been doing this long enough to know exactly what the room's temperature was. She read the will clearly and without drama. Darren received the house and $47,000 in savings, the accumulated careful thrift of a man who had lived simply for 30 years. Reed received the Harlan May in full, undivided, as described. $3 valuation, as is condition. When Margaret Ash stepped out to make copies, Darren leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice with the precision of someone adjusting an instrument. "I'll give you $15,000 cash today, right now. We can have a check cut before lunch." Reed looked at him. "You're living in your truck, Reed. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because I know what $15,000 means to a man in your position." He kept his voice even and reasonable, the voice of a man making an argument he believed was self-evident. "That ferry has been sitting in river mud for 30 years. The hull is compromised. You'd spend $20,000 just making it legally habitable. This is the practical decision." Reed said nothing for a moment. In the parking lot outside the window, Atlas was sitting up in the truck cab, visible through the glass, watching the door Reed had walked through. "I'll think about it," Reed said, which was not a yes. Darren heard it as a yes. The road to the river ran south out of Parsons, through flat farmland, and then into a stretch of bottomland timber, second-growth sycamore and river birch that crowded the shoulders and made the afternoon light feel provisional, like something that might be taken back at any moment. Reed drove it slowly because he was not in a hurry. He had not been in a hurry in 3 years. Hurry required a destination you believed in. The GPS lost the address half a mile from the river. He followed a gravel track that someone had marked with a hand-lettered sign nailed to a fence post, River Access, Chutchkow Colton Boat Lot, and came out of the trees into a clearing that opened onto the Tennessee. He stopped the truck. The Harlan May was 40 yards from shore, grounded in a shelf of river mud that had built up around her hull over decades until it had the settled permanence of a geological feature. She was 68 feet from bow to stern. Reed would learn this later from Pete Arden, and she sat tilted roughly 4 degrees to starboard, which gave her the look of something that had leaned over to look at something in the water and had never straightened back up. The paint was gone. Not peeling. Gone. Taken down to bare steel in most places, with rust blooming in patterns that had the accidental artistry of things that had been left alone long enough to become themselves. The wheelhouse windows were intact but gray with 40 years of river grime. On the forward mast, the remnant of a yellow and black pennant moved in the river wind. The top third of the fabric had rotted away, but what remained held its shape with a stubbornness that seemed personal. Atlas was out of the truck before Reed cut the engine. The dog walked to the river's edge and stood there with his nose working the air, not dramatically, not with the full-body engagement of tracking, but with the quiet, purposeful reading of an animal cataloging a new place. He turned his head slowly, taking in the ferry, the mudflat, the tree line downstream. Then he sat down in the grass and waited for Reed to join him. Reed joined him. They stood together at the water's edge for a while, looking at what $3 had bought. "You're the one who got the ferry." Reed turned. A man was coming along the bank from the direction of a battered silver trailer parked in the trees. 70 years old at least, wearing canvas work pants and a jacket that had been green once. He walked with the unhurried gait of someone who had spent his whole life moving along riverbanks and had stopped worrying about the footing. "That's right," Reed said. The man stopped beside him and looked at the Harlan May with the assessing eye of someone who had a specific relationship with this vessel and was deciding how much of it to share. "Pete Arden. I was the engineer on the May for 9 years before Earl ran her aground. I've been watching her rust ever since." He paused. Hull's sound. People assume she isn't, but they assume wrong. Earl knew what he was doing when he grounded her. Soft mud, protected from current by that sandbar. She's been sitting in the same 4 degrees for 31 years. He looked at Atlas. "That your dog?" "Yes." Pete Arden nodded slowly, the way people nodded at things they had been given information about that they intended to hold on to. He did not say anything else about the dog. He didn't need to. Nora Fisk ran a place called the River Grind out of a converted bait shop 30 yards from the bank. 4 tables inside, 2 outside on a porch that needed new boards, and a coffee machine that appeared to have been purchased when the county was young. She was 68, with white hair kept short and practical, and the economy of movement of someone who had learned not to waste steps. She brought Reed a cup without being asked, and looked at Atlas the way certain people looked at dogs, not nervous, not performing enthusiasm, just looking, taking the measure of the animal with the same directness she used for everything else. "Earl talked about you," she said. She set a bowl of water on the floor near the door without asking. Atlas walked to it and drank without looking up. "He talked about the dog more than he talked about you," she clarified. "That's not an insult. That's just the way Earl was." Reed wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "How well did you know him?" "Well enough to know the ferry wasn't worthless." She said it flatly, without emphasis, as if stating the temperature outside. Earl wasn't a man who held on to worthless things. She looked out the porch window toward the river. He held on to that ferry for 31 years and turned down 3 offers that I know of. Whatever's on it, or in it, he thought it was worth keeping. Reed was about to ask her what she meant when the sound of a car door reached them from the gravel lot out front. Then another. Then voices. 2 of them, one he recognized. Darren came around the side of the building first, moving with the brisk confidence of a man arriving somewhere he had already been. Behind him were 2 men in the kind of suits that cost enough to be visible without being obvious. The suits of people who made decisions about things they would never personally touch. One carried a leather portfolio, the other carried nothing, which in Reed's experience meant he was the one who made the actual decisions. "Reed?" Darren spotted him on the porch and altered his course without breaking stride. "Good. I was hoping you'd already be out here." He introduced the men the way you introduce people whose importance you want others to feel, without stating it directly. Meridian River Properties, out of Nashville. They were evaluating a marina development project along this section of the Tennessee. A full-scale recreational development, boat slips, lodging, access roads. They had been in conversation with Earl about the property. Darren said this last part as a statement, not an explanation. Reed looked at the man with the portfolio. "You were in conversation with Earl?" The man smiled the smile of someone who had learned to smile at this kind of question. "We expressed interest in the parcel. Mr. Colton Sr. had some reservations." "Reservations?" Reed said. "He ultimately declined our offer." The smile held. "We're hoping the new ownership might take a different view. We're prepared to be generous." Darren turned to Reed with the particular expression he had worn Reed's entire life when he wanted something. Not aggressive, not pleading, but carrying the full weight of his certainty that the reasonable thing was whatever Darren had already decided. "Reed, these men have a real offer, numbers that mean something. You've been living out of a truck. I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because—" "You said that already," Reed said. "This morning." A beat of silence. Nora had gone very still inside, near the coffee machine. Pete Arden appeared at the edge of the clearing, hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped when he saw the suits. He did not come closer. He did not leave. Atlas had come to stand beside Reed's chair. He had not made a sound. He simply moved, crossed the porch, positioned himself at Reed's left side, and stood there. His ears were forward. His body was level, not tense, not aggressive, simply present in the way that 91 pounds of trained animal is present, which communicates without effort and without ambiguity. The man with the portfolio looked at Atlas. The man who carried nothing looked at Atlas. Darren looked at Atlas and then looked at Reed with an expression that had something new in it, something that was not quite anger and not quite worry, but occupied the space between them. Reed stood up. "I haven't made any decisions," he said. He picked up his coffee cup. "I'll let you know." He went inside. Nora handed him a second cup without commenting on any of it. Through the window, he watched Darren walk back toward his car with the 2 men, talking in the lowered voice register of people revising a plan. Outside, Atlas remained on the porch. He sat facing the parking lot until Darren's Lexus pulled out of the gravel and disappeared onto the access road. Then he turned and came inside and lay down under Reed's table and put his chin on his front paws. That night, Reed used a length of rope and the truck's running board to climb onto the May's stern deck. The metal groaned under his weight, but held. He unrolled his sleeping bag against the back wall of the wheelhouse and lay on his back, looking at a sky that was clear for the first time in days. The stars over the river, the particular density they get when there is no town close enough to dilute them. Atlas jumped the gap from the bank without needing to be called. He walked the deck once, bowed astern, checking the edges, then came back and lay down against Reed's side. The ferry settled in the mud around them, with the slow, periodic sound of something that had made its peace with where it was. Reed had not made his peace with anything in a long time, but he was here. That was a start. The second morning on the river, Reed woke before dawn to the sound of Atlas moving. Not the casual shifting of a large dog rearranging himself in sleep. This was purposeful movement, the particular sound of paws on metal grating that had a direction to it. Reed lay still for a moment, listening to the ferry settle around him, identifying the sounds the way he identified all sounds in the first seconds after waking. Threat or no threat, action required or no action required. Old training. It did not turn off. No threat. He sat up. Gray light was just beginning to work its way through the wheelhouse windows, turning the river outside from black to the color of old pewter. Atlas was at the forward end of the main deck, nose down, moving in the slow, deliberate arcs, Reed associated with the dog working a specific scent, not covering ground, not searching, but reading a fixed point from multiple angles, the way you might read a sentence in a language you almost understood. Reed pulled on his boots and followed. The main deck of the Harlan May was 62 feet of rust-stained steel plating, interrupted by 2 deck hatches, a forward capstan that had seized solid decades ago, and the base structure of the wheelhouse that rose from the aft third of the vessel. The keel was grounded in mud, which meant the deck sat roughly 3 feet above the waterline. Close enough that at high water, Reed figured, the river probably came up over the forward section entirely. The mud smell was constant and specific, the particular combination of river bottom and organic decay and standing water that became its own weather after a while. Atlas had stopped near the forward hatch. His nose was not at the hatch itself. It was directed toward the base of the wheelhouse structure, specifically toward the seam where the wheelhouse wall met the deck plating, where 3 decades of river silt had accumulated in a dark crescent. His tail was level, not raised, not lowered. His ears were forward, the folded one showing its crease more clearly than usual. He looked up at Reed once, then back at the wall. "Pete," Reed said later that morning, standing on the bank with a cup of Nora's coffee. "The wheelhouse, the captain's cabin, is it accessible from the main deck?" Pete Arden looked at him with the evaluating expression of someone deciding how much explaining was going to be required. "There's an interior door at the base of the aft stairwell. Steel frame, heavy gauge. The lock mechanism seized up sometime in the mid-90s. He paused. "Why?" "Atlas found something." Pete was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ferry, then at Atlas, who was sitting at Reed's feet, looking at the ferry. "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet." Pete nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating a set of expectations. "I've got a pipe wrench in the trailer, and time." They worked the door for 40 minutes. The problem was not the lock. The lock had been a standard marine deadbolt, and the cylinder had corroded to the point where the distinction between locked and unlocked was academic. The problem was the frame. 31 years of temperature cycling had compressed the steel door into its frame with a uniformity that was almost impressive, the kind of fit that happens when metal has had decades to decide it prefers a particular configuration. Pete worked the perimeter with the pipe wrench, while Reed applied leverage with a 2-foot length of galvanized pipe he had found in the forward locker. They did not talk much. Men who have done physical work together before find their way into a rhythm without narrating it. Pete understood which side of a problem to be on, and when to hold and when to apply force. Reed respected that. Atlas had gone into the water. Reed noticed this from the corner of his eye. The dog had dropped off the forward deck into the shallows without ceremony and was wading along the hull toward the aft section. The water was dark with silt, probably thigh-deep on a man, chest-deep on Atlas. The dog moved through it without hesitation, his head above the surface, tracking along the hull with his nose working at the waterline. Then he disappeared around the stern. Reed heard it before he saw it. The specific sound of a large dog scratching at a surface that was not giving. Metal on metal. Rhythmic, purposeful. He and Pete looked at each other. Reed climbed down into the water. It was cold, October River cold, the kind that takes your breath in a specific and immediate way. And he moved along the hull to the stern and found Atlas on the other side, where a secondary access door sat 3 feet above the waterline on the river side of the vessel. It was smaller than the main cabin door, designed for crew access from a dock or gangway that no longer existed. The dog was standing with his front paws braced against the hull, scratching at the lower edge of the doorframe, his nails dragging across rust with the focused monotony of something that had decided this was the correct thing to do and intended to continue. Reed put his hand on the door, not locked, not seized in the same way. The handle, a simple lever mechanism, had corroded in the closed position, but when he applied pressure with both palms and lifted slightly to take the weight off the frame, it gave. Slowly, protesting in the voice of metal that has not been asked to move in a very long time. He pushed it open. The smell came out first. Old paper, old wood, the particular dry stillness of a space that has been sealed long enough to develop its own atmosphere. Not rot, not damp, despite the water below. Someone had done something to the interior of this room to protect it. Reed would figure out later that Earl had lined the walls with a tar-based sealant and fitted the door with a rubber gasket that had held for 3 decades with more reliability than anyone had a right to expect. He climbed through. The captain's cabin was 7 feet by 9 feet, low-ceilinged, lit only by the gray river light coming through 2 small portholes that were coated in grime but intact, a bolted chair, a navigation table fixed to the wall, and a ship's desk, the original oak construction, fitted with 4 drawers on the right side and a locking compartment across the top. Atlas came through the door behind him, shaking river water across the floor without concern. He walked directly to the desk, not sniffing. He had already done whatever work his nose required outside. He walked to the desk and sat in front of it and looked at the locked compartment across the top, waiting. Reed found a flat-blade screwdriver in his jacket pocket from the morning's work on the door. The lock on the compartment was a simple wafer mechanism, the kind that could be opened by a man who was willing to be patient and apply pressure in the correct sequence. He worked it for 4 minutes. It gave. Inside, a hand-drawn map on heavy drafting paper, the pencil lines still crisp after 30 years in a sealed space. The river was drawn in from memory rather than survey. The bends and sandbars recognizable, but not precise. The way a man draws a place he knows by feel rather than measurement. The bender's property was marked in red pencil, its boundaries extending significantly farther than anything Reed had been shown at the lawyer's office. And beside the map, a small manila envelope, sealed with wax rather than adhesive, with Reed's name written on the outside in the deliberate print of a man who wanted to make sure he was readable. Reed opened the envelope. 1 key on a plain ring, brass, worn smooth from handling, and a folded square of paper in Earl's handwriting, the same deliberate print, each letter standing upright and separate as if the words needed room to breathe. Reed, don't trust what your brother tells you about this property. He knows more than he's saying and has known longer than you think. Start with the key. Margaret Ash's father kept a safe in his office at the law firm, the old one on Depot Street. She has it now. This key opens it. What's inside explains everything. I'm sorry I ran out of time to tell you this myself. I tried to find you for 2 years. You were hard to find. Bring the dog everywhere. He already knows. Uncle Earl. Reed read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his inside jacket pocket, the way you put something you intend to return to when you are in a position to process it fully. He looked at Atlas. The dog was watching him with the level attention he gave to moments when something important had shifted. His tail moved once, a single slow arc left to right. "Okay," Reed said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. He sat down on the bolted chair in the captain's cabin with river water still dripping from his boots onto the sealed floor, and read Earl's note a third time, and the key in his palm was warm from his hand and worn smooth from Earl's. And outside the river moved past the hull the way it had been moving for 31 years, indifferent and patient, carrying everything downstream that was not held in place by something stronger than current. Reed did not tell anyone about the note that day. He folded the map and put it with the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where men who have learned to carry important things keep them. He replaced the key in the manila envelope and kept it in his boot. Old habit. The things you cannot afford to lose go on your body, not in your bag. He and Pete worked through the afternoon, making the captain's cabin accessible, clearing the secondary door, cleaning the porthole glass until gray river light came through properly, determining that the deck above the cabin was structurally sound. Pete asked no questions about what Reed had found inside. This was the quality Reed had come to appreciate most about Pete Arden in 2 days of knowing him. The man understood that information offered itself when it was ready, and pressing it only made it go somewhere harder to reach. Nora brought food at 5 o'clock, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, the kind of food that requires no ceremony and makes no demands. She set them on a flat section of the forward deck railing and left without staying, which was also a quality Reed was coming to appreciate. Atlas ate his portion in 4 seconds and then sat facing upriver, watching something Reed could not identify. Darren called at 8:47 that evening. Reed was sitting on the stern deck with his back against the wheelhouse wall, watching the river go dark. The Tennessee at night in October had a particular quality. The water moved without sound at this section, the current slow enough that you felt it more than heard it, and the far bank was a line of black trees against a sky that held the last of the light longer than seemed reasonable. He looked at the name on the screen for a moment before answering, "I've been patient, Reed." Darren's voice had shed the practiced reasonableness of the morning. It was flatter now, with an efficiency that Reed recognized as the voice people used when they had decided to stop performing and start applying pressure. "My lawyer reviewed the will this afternoon. There are grounds to contest the soundness of Earl's mental state at the time of signing. He was on medication. The dosage was significant." Reed said nothing. "I'm not saying I want to go that route. I'm saying the option exists, and it would tie this up in probate for 18 months minimum. 18 months while you pay property taxes on a piece of river mud you can't use and can't sell." A pause calibrated for effect. "Or you take $15,000 today, I'll have a check cut first thing tomorrow, and we both walk away clean." "You said 48 hours this morning," Reed said. "It's been 12. I revised the timeline." Reed looked at the river. A piece of driftwood was moving through the near-bank shallows, slow and purposeful, catching the last light. "I'll let you know," he said. "Reed," he ended the call. He sat for a while with the phone face down on the deck beside him. Atlas had come to the stern from wherever he had been and was standing 3 feet away, not looking at Reed, looking at the water below. The river moved past the hull with the sound of something that had been doing this since before anyone alive could remember and intended to continue. Reed thought about Earl at a kitchen table, writing a note, sealing it in wax. Trying to find Reed for 2 years. You were hard to find. He had been hard to find on purpose. After Cheryl left, after the house went, after the job at the distribution center, after he stopped answering numbers he did not recognize because nothing that came from a number he did not recognize had ever improved his situation. He had systematically made himself difficult to locate. Paid cash, changed phones, stayed out of databases. He had told himself it was practical. He had understood for a long time that it was not only practical. If no one could find you, no one could tell you things you were not ready to hear. Earl had been trying to tell him something for 2 years. And Reed had been parked in a Walmart lot in Knoxville, not answering numbers he did not recognize. The flashback did not announce itself. They never did. They arrived the way the ambush had arrived, without warning, without the preparatory signal that would have made the difference. One moment Reed was on the deck of a grounded ferry in Tennessee, watching driftwood move through dark water. The next moment the dark water was something else entirely. Not a scene, not images. The flashback was never images. It was sensation, specific and total, the way certain memories bypass the part of the brain that processes them as past and land instead in the part that processes them as now. The sound of machinery dying. That was where it always started. Not gunfire, not the specific sounds of a firefight. Those he could manage. What he could not manage was the sound of something mechanical failing in the middle of a situation that required it not to fail. The sound of an engine cutting out at the wrong moment. The particular register of a vehicle that had been running and then was not running. In a place where the difference between those two states was the difference between certain outcomes. Fallujah, 2006. A supply route that had been cleared twice that week. The truck in front had lost power, just lost it, for reasons that would be debated in the after-action for 6 weeks. Seized in the middle of a stretch of road with no cover on either side. Reed's truck directly behind, already in the kill zone before anyone understood that was what it was. He had made decisions in the following 4 seconds that he had reviewed every day since. The decisions were the right decisions. He knew this. He had known it from the after-action, from the debrief, from every rational assessment of the situation anyone had ever offered. The decisions were tactically correct. Corporal Diaz and Sergeant Harmon were dead because the truck had seized in that location at that moment, not because of Reed's decisions. He knew this. He sat with his back against the wheelhouse wall of a grounded ferry in Tennessee, and he knew this. And knowing it and feeling it were not the same thing, and had not been the same thing for 8 years. Atlas pressed into his side. Not gently. The dog put his full weight against Reed's left flank, 91 pounds of solid contact, warm and immediate, the specific gravity of an animal that had done this before and understood the mechanics of it. Not comfort in the way people offered comfort, something more structural than that. The dog was a fixed point. The dog was real weight in a specific location. And real weight in a specific location was something Reed's nervous system could organize itself around when it could not organize itself around anything else. Reed's hand found the dog's flank without him deciding to put it there. He felt the ribs rise, fall, rise, fall. Slower than his own breathing, more deliberate. He matched it without meaning to, the old technique, the one the VA counselor had given him 4 years ago before he stopped going to the VA. Breathe at the rhythm of something slower than your own panic, and your nervous system will eventually believe the emergency is over. The river moved past the hull. The sound of the water was not the sound of machinery dying. It was the sound of water. He held on to that distinction and breathed at the rhythm of Atlas's ribs and let the ferry settle around him in its small, periodic sounds. Metal in mud, the creak of the railing in the river wind, something small moving in the wheelhouse overhead. He did not know how long they sat like that. Long enough for the stars to establish themselves fully overhead, the river dark enough now that he could not see the far bank. Long enough for the cold to work through his jacket in the way river cold did, not abrupt, but insistent, taking the warmth from the outside in. He thought about Darren's voice on the phone, that flat efficiency, the pressure precisely calibrated. He thought about Earl's handwriting on the envelope, each letter standing upright and separate. He thought about what Pete Arden had said on the first day. Hull's sound. People assume she isn't, but they assume wrong. Earl knew what he was doing. Earl had known what he was doing. And Darren had known something too. Had known it, Earl said, longer than Reed thought. Had known it and said nothing, offered $15,000 for something he already understood was worth significantly more, moved with a speed and precision that was not the speed and precision of a man improvising. Reed looked at the key in his palm. He had taken it out of his boot without noticing. Worn smooth from Earl's handling, brass going slightly green at the bow, the kind of key that belonged to something that had been important for a long time. He closed his fingers around it. Atlas lifted his chin from Reed's shoulder and turned to look at him directly. The full level attention the dog reserved for moments when he was checking something specific rather than monitoring generally. His eyes caught the starlight the way animal eyes did, with a faint reflection that made them look lit from inside. Reed looked back at the dog. "I know," he said. The words came out with more weight than he intended. "I know." He was not sure exactly what he was agreeing to, but Atlas seemed to consider it sufficient. The dog turned back to face the river, leaned his weight more firmly into Reed's side, and did not move again for a long time. The river went on doing what rivers do. He was at the law office on Depot Street when it opened at 8:30. The building was a converted Victorian house with a porch that had been enclosed sometime in the 70s and a sign that read, "Ash Legal Services." The Fisk name had come down at some point, leaving only one half of the original partnership. Margaret Ash answered the door herself. She was younger than her voice had suggested on the phone, mid-40s, practical in the way of women who had learned that practicality was its own kind of authority. She looked at Reed. She looked at Atlas beside him. She did not comment on either. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said. She stepped back and let them in. The safe was in the back office, behind a desk that had belonged to her father and still had his chair, a leather thing that had conformed over decades to the specific shape of a man who was no longer there to sit in it. The safe was floor-mounted, steel, with the solid indifference of something built in an era when things were built to outlast the people who bought them. Margaret Ash had not opened it since her father died 4 years ago. She had not known what was in it. She had known the safe existed and had kept it because getting rid of it had required an energy she had never found the occasion for. Reed put Earl's key in the lock. It turned on the first try, which was the kind of thing that happened when a key had been made for a specific lock and kept for a specific purpose and used at the specific moment it was meant to be used. Inside, 2 expandable file folders, rubber-banded closed, labeled in her father's handwriting. The first read, "Colton, Bender's Landing, Transfer Documents, 1984. The second read, "Colton, Earl R., Correspondence." Reed carried both folders to the desk. Margaret Ash stood near the window with her arms crossed and said nothing, which Reed understood as permission to take the time he needed. He opened the first folder. The documents were dense: deed transfer records, survey plats, notarized affidavits, the specific legal architecture of a transaction that had been constructed to look clean. Reed was not a lawyer, but he had spent 14 years in the Marines reading documents designed to obscure what they were actually authorizing, and he had developed a specific skill for finding the sentence in a dense block of text that carried the weight the rest of the text was trying to distribute away from it. He found it on page 4 of the transfer agreement, a signature line, witnessed and notarized. The signatory was listed as James Earl Colton, Earl's father, Reed's paternal grandfather, transferring 4.2 acres of riverfront property, including dock rights and commercial bender's easement to a holding company called Meridian River Associates. Meridian River Associates. Reed sat with that for a moment. Then he went back to the manila envelope and looked at the business card the developer's representative had handed him 2 days ago at the river. Meridian River Properties, Nashville, Tennessee. Not the same name, a variation. The kind of variation that happened when a holding company restructured over 40 years of transactions and acquisitions, keeping the primary word and adjusting the secondary one to reflect current corporate structure. He opened the second folder. Earl's Correspondence, 20 years of letters between Earl and Margaret Ash's father, the senior Ash, who had been Earl's private attorney since 1989. The letters were organized chronologically, and Reed read them in order, which was the only way to read a story that built toward something. The picture assembled itself over 30 pages. James Earl Colton, the grandfather, had signed the 1984 transfer under duress that was documented in a letter the senior Ash had written contemporaneously and filed in his own records, apparently as insurance against a situation that had never fully resolved itself. The original holding company had approached the grandfather with a fraudulent survey showing the Benders Landing property as commercially non-viable, had offered a price that seemed reasonable against that fraudulent valuation, and had obtained the signature through a combination of financial pressure and manufactured time constraints. The senior Ash had been brought in after the fact and had immediately recognized the discrepancy between the fraudulent survey and the actual survey on file with the county. He had spent 3 years attempting to build a case for recovery and had been blocked at each turn by legal maneuvering that indicated the original buyer had significant resources and local relationships. The grandfather had died in 1991 without the matter resolved. Earl had inherited the knowledge of it along with everything else. He had continued pursuing it quietly for 30 years with the senior Ash's help, documenting the chain of ownership as the holding company restructured and evolved into what was now Meridian River Properties. The most recent letter in the file was dated 8 months ago, written by Earl in the shaky hand of a man whose illness had begun affecting his motor control, addressed to Margaret Ash directly, not her father, who had been dead for 4 years by then. Margaret, your father kept this safe because he believed the time would come when the documentation would mean something. I believe that time is now. The company is moving on the river corridor. I have found out that my nephew Darren has been in contact with their development team and has agreed to facilitate the transfer of the ferry property in exchange for a finder's arrangement. He does not know what is in the safe. I am leaving the ferry to Reed because Reed is the only member of this family who I trust to hold the line when holding the line costs something. I am sorry I cannot be there to explain this myself. Please give him the key when he comes. Reed set the letter down. He sat in the dead attorney's chair in the back office of a Victorian house on Depot Street and looked at the river light coming through the window and did not move for a while. Atlas had been lying under the desk. He came out now and sat beside the chair, close enough that his shoulder touched Reed's leg. He did not look up. He looked at the door, which was what Atlas did when he was positioning himself between Reed and whatever came next. Margaret Ash spoke from the window. My father talked about this case occasionally, not often. He said it was the one that bothered him most because the documentation was solid and the law wasn't moving. She paused. He would be glad it's moving now. Is it? Reed looked at her. Moving? 40 years of fraudulent transaction documentation, a chain of title that can be challenged, and a current development deal built on a corrupted foundation? She looked back at him with the level assessment of a woman who had grown up around law and knew exactly what it could and could not do. With the right attorney? Yes, it's moving. He found Darren at the river. This surprised him. Darren was not a man who spent time at rivers or at any place that required the specific patience of waiting for something to happen on its own timeline. But Darren's Lexus was in the gravel lot, and Darren was standing on the bank looking at the Harlan May with an expression that had shed all of its management and was simply what it was, a man looking at something he had expected to own by now and did not own. Reed walked to the bank and stood beside him. He did not say anything immediately. He had spent the drive from Depot Street deciding how to do this, and had concluded that the direct approach was the only one that would not turn into something neither of them came back from cleanly. He took the documents from the folder, not all of them, just the letter and the transfer agreement and the page with the Meridian River Associates' name, and set them on the hood of Darren's Lexus with the flat economy of a man completing a task. Darren looked down at the documents. Reed watched him read. He watched the moment when Darren's eyes reached the Meridian River Properties business card that Reed had placed beside the 1984 document. The moment when the connection became unavoidable, and the story Darren had been telling himself about what he knew, and when he knew it ran into the documentation of what he had actually done. Darren's jaw worked once. He put one hand flat on the hood of the car, not for emphasis, but because he needed it there. He looked at the river. He did not look at Reed. "I didn't know about the fraud," he said finally. "The 1984 transaction. I didn't know any of that." "I believe you," Reed said. And he did. Darren was not a man who had researched the provenance of a corrupt transaction. He was a man who had seen an opportunity and taken it without asking the questions that would have complicated the answer. "I knew the land was worth more than we were telling you. The development company told me they needed the ferry property to complete the corridor." Darren's voice had the quality of a man testifying to something he had hoped he would never have to testify to. "They offered me $800,000 in finder's fees. I thought Earl left you the worthless piece on purpose to keep you out. That's what I thought." Reed looked at the Harlan May. The crippled pennant on the mast moved in the river wind. "Earl left me the ferry because it was the key," Reed said. "Literally." Darren said nothing. Pete Arden was visible downstream, pretending to work on something near his trailer. Nora was on her porch with coffee. She was not drinking. Neither of them was looking at the two men on the bank, which meant both of them were. Atlas sat between Reed and the river, facing outward toward the water, ears forward, tracking the light on the surface with the patient attention of an animal that had done everything it needed to do and was now simply present for whatever came next. Reed picked up the documents from the hood of the car. "I'm keeping the ferry," he said. "I'm filing with the county recorder this week, and I'm sending copies of the transfer documents to the state attorney general's office." He looked at Darren. "What you do with that is your business." He turned and walked back toward the bank. Behind him, he heard Darren's car door open, then close. The engine started. Gravel moved under tires, slowly at first, and then faster, and then the sound of it receded up the access road and was replaced by the sound of the river. Atlas stood up from the bank and walked to Reed's side. One slow tail wag, low and unhurried, the way the dog acknowledged something that had gone the way it needed to go. Nora called from her porch, not loudly. "Coffee's still hot." Pete turned from his trailer and looked at Reed across 30 yards of riverbank. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had been waiting a long time for a situation to resolve itself correctly and was satisfied, now that it had, to return to his own business. Reed walked to Nora's porch. Atlas walked beside him, not behind him. 3 months passed the way months pass on a river, not evenly, but in the specific rhythms of water and weather and the slow work of things being put right. The state attorney general's office opened an inquiry into the 1984 transfer within 6 weeks of receiving Reed's documentation. Margaret Ashe filed the title challenge on behalf of Earl's estate the same week. The development company's legal team responded with the expected volume of correspondence, which Margaret received with the equanimity of a woman who had grown up watching her father handle exactly this kind of response and had concluded from considerable observation. That volume was not the same thing as strength. Meridian River Properties withdrew its development application for the river corridor in early December, citing what its press release called a reassessment of project feasibility. The county recorder's office noted the withdrawal without comment. Pete Arden read about it in the Parsons paper and left a copy on the Harlan May's forward deck without saying anything about it, which was the way Pete communicated things he considered important but did not want to make a production of. Darren did not call. Reed did not call Darren. There was not, Reed had concluded, a version of that conversation that helped either of them more than the silence did. Darren had made choices that could be accounted for by the specific combination of opportunity and willful incuriosity that ruined a certain kind of man without making him irredeemable. What happened to Darren from here was Darren's work to do, not Reed's. Reed had his own work. Pete Arden turned out to know more about river ferries than anyone Reed had encountered or was likely to encounter. He knew where to source parts for a 1967 diesel marine engine from a man in Savannah who ran a salvage operation out of a converted warehouse. He knew the specific technique for treating the Harlan May's hull rust without compromising the underlying steel, which was sounder than it had any right to be after 31 years in river mud. He knew that the 4-degree tilt could be corrected by controlled flooding of the starboard ballast tanks and that the process would take 2 days and was best done in November when the river ran low. Reed learned these things by working alongside Pete and not asking more questions than the work required. He learned other things from Nora, who had been collecting information about Decatur County for 68 years, and filed it with the precision of a woman who understood that information had value proportional to how well it was organized. She knew which county commissioner had been on the planning board in 1984 and which ones had received contributions from corporate entities with names resembling Meridian River Associates. She knew a journalist in Nashville who covered land use issues and had been looking for a documented case study in the specific kind of river corridor manipulation that had been operating in 3 counties for 2 decades. The journalist's name was Clara Webb. She drove down from Nashville on a Tuesday in November and spent 4 hours at Nora's 4-table coffee shop, reading through the documents Reed had organized in chronological order. Asking questions, Reed answered carefully and completely. Atlas lay under the table the entire time and did not move except once, when Clara reached down to scratch behind his ears, at which point he tolerated it with the dignified patience of an animal that had more important things to attend to but understood the social obligation. Clara's piece ran in January. Reed did not read it until Nora put a printed copy in his hand and stood there while he did. It was accurate. That was the main thing. It named the entities and the mechanisms without overstating what the documentation proved and without understating what it implied. It mentioned the Harlan May and Earl Colton and the key found in a sealed captain's cabin. It did not mention Reed by name, which had been the one condition he had set and which Clara had honored without requiring an explanation. By February, the May was level. Not floating, she was still grounded in her shelf of river mud, and Reed had no particular plans to change that. But she sat true, 4 degrees corrected by Pete's careful method, her deck horizontal for the first time in 3 decades. Reed had replaced the captain's cabin door with a proper marine fitting. He had run a generator line from a rented unit on shore and had 1 working light inside and 1 on the exterior, which was enough. He had built a workbench along the port wall of the main cabin from salvaged lumber. He worked at it in the mornings. He had no specific project. He repaired things that needed repairing, built what the ferry needed built, learned by doing what Pete did not have the patience to explain. His hands remembered how to work. They had always been better at that than his mind. On a morning in late February, with the river low and clear and the temperature just above freezing, Reed was sitting on the forward deck with his second cup of coffee and the week's paper when Atlas came up from the bank. The dog had taken to going down to the water in the early mornings, walking the bank, reading the river the way he read everything, with the steady, focused attention of an animal for whom information was neither urgent nor trivial, but simply ongoing. He walked at his own pace. The hitch in his rear left leg was more visible in the cold, but it did not slow him, and Reed had stopped watching for it with the particular anxiety of someone expecting a thing to get worse. Some things held steady. Atlas was one of them. The dog walked to the bow and stood there. He did not look back at Reed. He looked out at the river, the Tennessee in late February, running clear over its gravel bottom in the near shallows, the current visible as a darker line farther out where the channel ran. The far bank was bare trees still, but the willow on the downstream point had started to show the faintest green, the first color in a landscape that had been gray and brown for months. His nose worked the air slowly. His tail moved, Not the single deliberate wag that meant something specific had been resolved, but a low, unhurried movement, the kind that had no particular object and required no particular response, the kind that meant the morning was acceptable and the river was there, and the world in this particular location was operating within expected parameters. Reed watched him. He thought about Earl writing a note in a sealed cabin, leaving a key on a plain ring, trying to find a man who had made himself unfindable because unfindable felt like safe. He thought about what safe had actually cost him, the years of parking lots and pre-dawn phone calls and carefully maintained distance from anything that could tell him something he was not ready to hear. He thought about Darren, who had known the land was worth more and had said nothing, and he found that what he felt about it now was less than what he had felt about it in November. Not forgiveness exactly. Something quieter than forgiveness. The recognition that Darren had made a specific kind of mistake that Darren would carry, and that carrying it was not Reed's job. Reed's job was here. He looked at the Harlan May's forward mast, where the remnant of Earl's pennant still flew, the top third gone, the bottom two-thirds holding. He had thought about replacing it. He had decided not to. It had lasted 31 years in river weather, which was more than most things managed, and it had earned the right to keep flying in whatever condition it was in. He picked up his coffee. Atlas turned his head and looked at Reed across the length of the deck, the full, level attention, the one with weight behind it. Then he turned back to the river. His tail moved once more, slow and certain, and he put his nose into the cold morning air and read whatever the river was carrying downstream on that particular February morning, all the information of distance and current, and the long passage from somewhere north of there to somewhere south. Reed watched the water move. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to be somewhere else. Some truths wait 40 years for the right person to find them. And sometimes the right person needs a dog who already knows the way. If this story moved you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We have more coming, and every one of them starts at a river that was worth staying beside.